just a few words for Amale and Dan. Welcome back to your own house. I mean, I think actually architecture is in amazing shape right now. I think it's it's a golden moment for the field. And if you want to know what I mean by that, I think tonight's lecture will make it very clear. There is a kind of another generation of architect with us now and leading us that are refusing any sort of strong line between analysis, research, teaching, publication, practice. They operate very locally, but they also operate very globally. Like you can make triangles like Harlem, Houston, St. Petersburg, like very amazing triangulations, and there are many in this work. And so people can enjoy an office like this from so many different directions. People can get sucked in by the, whatever it is, 49 cities, or the agriculture and the farm and the street, or the work itself, or the teaching and so on. And actually, once you get to know the architects at the middle of all this, none of those ingredients can be pulled out. It's all like the minimum requirement. And just as any of those of you who have children know, compromise went out like 10 years ago. Compromise just simply means you don't have enough information, or you're an idiot. Or you're an idiot because you don't have enough information. So you have a kind of generation coming along that I really do believe that if only you had the right inputs and the right capacity to bring the right people together, you could sort of formulate a solution. Well, that's sort of the generation just arriving at school right now, but you already have role models for that generation, and I think the WORKac is just a fantastic example for that. It's a kind of a no-compromise office. They will no doubt say that's simply not true. And that they're constantly being beaten down and forced to accept things that they don't want and all of that. But that's not what I mean, because I don't think architecture is ever judged by the kind of erosion of ambition. It's judged by the ambition itself, and especially in a school of architecture. And I think really this is a no-compromise office. It's funny because I was asking about the AC. I always thought it was AC as in AC/DC. Like, I always thought it was alternative current. And I do think there is an alternative current in operation today, and it's very, very strong. And I think probably Amale and Dan would be the first to say they're not alone. There is a set of friends around the world that very much form an extended community, some of whom are here now. But I'm sure each and every one of those friends would say, without Amale and Dan, it wouldn't be really worth doing what we're doing. And I think those of us who teach with you feel the same way. So it's a real sort of ridiculous honor to be able to welcome you to your own stage. And these are also, and this is also something new, the idea of architects that smile. Because if architects smile, they might in the end have a life as well. So this is also the beginning of another kind of role model, which are architects that are like the rest of us, workaholics, attention deficit disorder, all these kinds of problems, and have a wonderful life. Amale and Dan.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. It's a great honor to be here tonight. In good form, Gavin has decided that no architect can just be an architect, so we're diplomats tonight, and with a very ambitious title. And so I just wanted to suggest that the title is more of a question, and the question should actually come at the end of the lecture and not at the beginning, in that these are some of the questions or the question that has emerged as a result of some of the work that we'll show tonight. And so if I'm thinking of your semester, we're kind of a couple of weeks before midterm in terms of some of the thinking. In the past few years, there's been a proliferation of architectural events around the theme of global practice. As a result, there are many aspects of this idea that we have now come to better understand: the 24-hour workday, the mind-boggling scales, the speed, the cash flow issues, the cultural differences, etc. With the notion of global practice comes that of global cities, with an idea that many thinkers of the global age, such as Saskia Sassen, have put forward, that there is seemingly an inside, a network of cities such as London, Paris, New York, and Tokyo that are global. And then there's the rest outside, many of which are, quote-unquote, emerging to become part of this global network. Other concerns of our globalized conditions have focused, and I would say rightly so, on the rate of urbanization, with questions around the livability of urban cores, around density, food availability, housing, mobility, infrastructure, and of course around environmental concerns. But what about the effects of global practice on architecture? Assuming for a moment that there is still a productive difference between the urban and the architectural, and we know not to take this for granted, and maybe the lecture shows that there isn't. I'm not sure yet. In the early 90s, architect Rem Koolhaas asked this question: what are the consequences of globalization on architecture? And turned it into the main project of his office, OMA. This unconditional engagement, even if at times still critical, exploded disciplinary boundaries, disempowered the canon, reframed the discourse, and searched for new territories at all cost. This position was not only set in opposition to the ardent proponents of autonomy, it was also radical in rejecting any notion that globalizing forces needed to be met with resistance, such as that of Frampton's regional criticism, for example, which interestingly seems to be the only ism that has survived, if not here, than in many architectural milieux of the so-called non-West context, this Rasim Badran in the Middle East. And yet, if one looks at global architecture today, one is overwhelmed by the resilience of meaning, as superficial as it has become. We all know the drill. In China, don't go pointy, and if you can, introduce enough curves that a figure 8 appears somewhere. In Africa, go tribal patterns meets local crafts, and in the Middle East, go Islamic patterns with a touch of gold and glitter. As Nizar Assayad writes in his essay From Modernism to Globalization, the global will be the century of the representation. It seems that the more global we become, the more anxious questions around identity remain. Many of these examples are not Orientalist in the way they reduce and trivialize a culture, rendering it incapable of escaping its superstitious, primordial, or religious roots. They constitute, in fact, a reverse Orientalism, as anthropologist Ahmed Khanna describes in his book, Dubai, the City as Corporation, where one-liner reductive motifs are used by local ruling elites to simultaneously sell a constructed authenticity to the world, while also constructing the myth of an original, authentic, and pure identity at the exclusion of many others. I would say that this is similar to camel racing in the UAE, which Suleiman Khalaf writes about, where the local elite has put forward this sport which was never that important and making it really a sort of focus of attention, kind of building a sense of identity around this meeting of the latest technology and the kind of oldest tradition. How then do we acknowledge this continued desire for representation while moving beyond this, I would say, false debate between the highly local and the global? How do we start articulating again, in similar but also in different ways, an architectural position vis-à-vis this question of representation? Should we, and if so, why and how? Echoing Timothy Mitchell in his essay, The Stage of Modernity, we would like to abandon any notion of a local that is original, authentic, and pure, in contrast to or outside of the global. The notion of a real that is out there, better or worse than its representation, is an effect of modernity, a modernity that is always already contaminated by what it excludes. In fact, the colonized was always already part of and constitutive of modernity. And so our hybrid identities and condition as architects, this is 100 architects in Orders, the friends that Mark was talking about, a seminal project by Ai Weiwei, the Chinese artist. So our hybrid identities and condition as architects matches the hybrid conditions that architecture has always been the result of, or at least the kinds of contaminated, hybridized architectures that we, in our work, find inspiring. From the Roman ruins of Petra to the embrace of modernism as an expression of national emergence, this is the Phoenicia in Beirut, or the experiments in tropical modernism, and later as well in kind of the sort of 70s and 80s embrace of that style throughout much of the globe. This condition of patient negotiation, of exchange, of subtle etiquette, a mix of idealism and pragmatism, and slight compromises, we do compromise, that come to new resolutions and new positions that are more and go beyond the first two that are already known, is this condition of diplomacy, as often represented by the kind of really interesting embassies of the 50s and 60s. This condition of diplomacy is not one of unconditional engagement. It is more like the diagram of architect and power, where the architect is trying to move power. The diplomat is neither inside nor outside, but in between, a go-between, fully embedded, powerless, powerful, and always at risk of failing. Actually, I would say failing constantly. And yet there is the quality of the conversation and the possibility to start a conversation or change the current conversation that belongs to diplomacy. For us, and for the past 5 years, this conversation has revolved around that of the environment, around representing, exploring, and possibly reinventing the relationship between the urban, the rural, and the natural as they intersect with the architectural. It started with Dan trying to read a big book at Union Square Market.
And so, okay. All right, so now we're going to show some projects also. Starting with Nature City. So it's a kind of world tour, a global that starts in Kaiser, as all global tours should, start in Kaiser, Oregon. Which is a suburb of Salem, Oregon, which appears to be a suburb of Portland. And this was a project for MoMA that started here at Columbia with the Buell hypothesis that Reinhold put forth, and then was an exhibition at MoMA looking at the future of the suburbs. We had recently completed our book, 49 Cities, about the urban and the ecological, and kind of took this opportunity to think about the role of the suburbs and the fact that there will always be people perhaps who want to live closer to nature. So really from the beginning taking as inspiration one of our favorite of the 49 cities, which was Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, which is a really interesting proposition. Unfortunately, it became the suburbs, but his original proposition was that his invention, the town country, would be the kind of best of both worlds of the rural and the urban. Of course, it turned out to be the worst. But this is the context within which we are working. This is Kaiser, Oregon, which is a fairly typical bedroom community with almost no commercial activity or cultural activity. But at the same time, it's in a very beautiful part of the state, right at the edge of incredible farmland, some of the best farmland on the West Coast. And we came to this project at the moment that Tiny Kaiser was in a kind of identity crisis. They foresaw 14,000 new people moving to Kaiser. And so one of the amazing things in Oregon is that every city is governed by an urban growth boundary, and this urban growth boundary kind of contains sprawl, which you can really see here. There's a really defined line. It's a little bit maybe too faded, but there's a very defined line between the urban and the natural. And Kaiser saw 14,000 people coming, and since they're a suburb, said that we have to kind of expand the urban growth boundary to accommodate the 14,000 people, which of course is not the idea of an urban growth boundary. And so we took that as a challenge and said, how can we put 14,000 new people in Kaiser? And so we found the site that was given to us by the Buell hypothesis, which was a kind of the only commercial activity in Kaiser, which is this big shopping mall, completely paved, site. And on this site, we decided to try to put 14,000 people in this kind of new vision of the suburbs. We did a lot of research about the suburbs, and kind of a few things stood out. One was the kind of combination, which we hadn't really realized. We knew that suburban houses were getting bigger, but we didn't realize that suburban lots are getting smaller. So you have this kind of increasing density with McMansionization, which is not really talked about. So in a way, we saw that as a kind of positive, that people were living closer together, even though they were in these enormous, ugly houses. And then secondly, that in the suburbs, there are only 19 identified types of real estate that can be financed by a bank. And these are the 19 types, of which housing is only one type. There's only one financeable type of housing in the suburbs, which is single-family houses. So this is our project on the site. The idea was to combine the urban, a very, very dense urban, with a very open natural space. And what we proposed was a project that is both 5 times as dense as a typical suburb, so really urban scale density, but that at the same time had 3 times the amount of open space. And so what we did was we kind of combined the urban into these piers. So the piers are very dense, urban, gridded condition, contrasted with a kind of reclaimed nature around. And so the nature was really, this is an amazing site. It's at the headlands of the watershed, and traditionally, or before there was a city, there was a kind of combination of Douglas fir forest and oak savanna. We worked with a great team of experts, including Eric Sanderson, a wildlife ecologist, who kind of worked with us on reclaiming the nature. And then we worked with Professor Jerry Frug from Harvard on the social aspects and what would make a good living experience on the urban. And so a kind of explosion of the types of multifamily and single-family housing that could be accommodated on the site. Everything from kind of shared live-work apartments to high-rise towers to very, very dense single-family homes. And you have this condition where you have nature or shared land, a kind of series of landscapes, from the big shared landscape to the shared nature, let's say, where you could hike and encounter wildlife and bears and things, to private gardens to smaller landscapes. And this is what the project looked like. And at the same time, we proposed that every housing type would be combined with infrastructure, so that the entire city would kind of be a model of new sustainable infrastructure, with every housing type combined with an infrastructure type. So for example, everything from water gardens, this would be a new natural water filtration plant for all the wastewater in the village, in the town, which would be processed underneath the housing, and then kind of the last stage of these wetlands, which would become an amenity for that type of housing. Which you see here. So you have this kind of inside, outside, upside down condition. We needed water pressure, so we introduced the high-rise towers instead of water towers. And then the water pressure is provided by waterfalls. So every sustainable infrastructural element becomes a visible element within the building as well. And then because we had the high-rises, this was our live-work situation, where you had kind of 3-story suburban house types stacked into this tower with a waterfall in the middle. And then the most radical one was, we proposed that all the vegetable waste in the city be brought to this enormous compost mound, where we could collect methane in a huge methane dome. And since we had the methane dome and the heat, we built terraced housing around it with neighborhood pools at the top, which would be heated by the compost. So that's a vision of that. And then certain places allow the nature to run through, so that animals and wildlife would kind of have their experience of the nature, while the city was also a continuous urban fabric. And we worked also with the ad agency Wyden Kennedy to kind of propose this vision. Should I skip this? And they created a couple ads for the new city. idea was to engage MoMA audience by making it as real as possible, since MoMA is no longer the cultural elite, but really everyone who comes to the event.
Stuff. Dial the number on your screen, and we promise to pick up. I mostly just like watching videos on YouTube.
Is New Holland Island in St. Petersburg, a project, international competition we won in 2011, and we just completed the master plan, and after winning the competition started to collaborate with Jorge Otero Pailos on, as the site is this triangular island in the middle of St. Petersburg, which was kind of carved artificially by Peter the Great. And on the current island, existing warehouses that we were sort of hired to think about how to transform into a kind of cultural center and sort of mixed-use development. Many of the requirements were about really kind of, from the sort of Landmarks Commission, were about preserving much of the warehouses, as well as trying to kind of complete the ensemble, sort of very Russian word for this kind of perimeter closed site. So what was interesting in looking at the history of the site was the incredible transformation and layers from the very beginning of carving the island by Peter the Great to turning the warehouses or building the warehouses to basically dry wood to build ships. This was the kind of NASA of Russia. And the wood would be sort of placed vertically to have the air go and really dry it. The first reforming prison was built on the site. And most interestingly, Mendelev's lab, who invented the periodical table of elements, was kind of right there. Mendeleev was, we discovered after winning the competition, obsessed with balloons and kind of phase-changing materials. And then finally, this was a kind of historically very loaded site with a number of structures, including the radio stations from which Lenin declared the kind of winning of the revolution. When we arrived after winning the competition, much of these structures had been already destroyed by Norman Foster, who had won the competition once before us. And so, you know, our... personally? And so our, you know, we arrived there sort of humbled a little bit as architects and wanting to work much more strategically with the existing heritage and to really try to reveal the heritage rather than kind of surgically, rather than kind of impose large structures on it. And so the first sort of instinct was to work with landscape and turn the entire island into a kind of public park. This island had been closed to the public for centuries, and so just the fact of opening it up and introducing the people in it was kind of the most radical move we can make. And in terms of kind of adding a structure, the structure would be really a kind of continuation of that landscape and would contain most of the infrastructure of the island to minimize the kind of impact on the existing warehouse buildings, as well as from the beginning kind of hold a sort of a balloon. The idea was that, you know, you would want to experience St. Petersburg from high up without having to sort of necessarily build a tower. And so we wanted this park to be open and kind of a year-long sort of event for the people of St. Petersburg. But what was the kind of fascinating challenge for us was how we were going to turn the warehouses into sort of some structures that are inhabitable with kind of new use and new occupation to really experience the density of these walls that were built to kind of dry the wood. Incredibly dense, incredibly beautiful structures. So there were two strategies we were sort of kind of obsessed with. The first was kind of going back to the TGB and the idea of carving the voids within a mass. In this case, the mass was already there, and so all we would need would be to carve enough to introduce larger programs. But the second, we were really interested in Mata Clark's strategy, where the idea is by removing mass, you actually reveal density. Almost counterintuitively, and create these kinds of views and experiences. And finally, trying to bring this notion of the park and landscape into the structures, both literally but also conceptually, in terms of bringing the public really to kind of occupy the interior of the buildings. And luckily, there is this kind of really rich history of winter gardens in St. Petersburg that we were kind of building on. And so this kind of very surgical carving and introducing of these gardens on the interior would be the way to kind of rehabilitate the structure while minimizing impact. And so the park and the landscape on the outside is really brought in through a promenade on the inside, which connects these new programs and these kind of winter gardens. And strategically working with the client, who's a developer, this became a way to keep the public inside the buildings, with a kind of layer of public at the ground floor, public at the roof, leaving the middle to become private. And so these are some of the kind of kind of experiences we were proposing with this kind of promenade and cutting through and connecting kind of various programs, where the sort of generic ones would continue to exist within the walls, and then you'd have exceptions at the moment of the cut. The promenade really became the kind of infrastructural tube that connects all the buildings, and placing it at the height of the structure, minimizing the impact at the lower part where the walls are most fragile. Working with Jorge, we developed this idea that this promenade would really become a kind of interpretation path. And so you would experience not only the site as it is now, but also this kind of intangible heritage, all the narratives and stories of the island as you kind of moved around it. But also in it, sort of moving up and down the promenade, which you see here. Programmatically, the island is divided into a kind of tech hub, cultural center, and a mixed use of commercial and residential. And you can see that in the plans we maintain the kind of rigor of the walls while interrupting it with these kind of moments there. Here you read the kind of rhythm of the density of walls. And finally, kind of bringing the promenade down at the last kind of mixed-use building to become an arcade. Jorge proposed this really interesting way of kind of identifying the bricks that really needed repair, and not doing that in a kind of homogeneous way. And what was really funny is showing the client, what is there now and what the renovation would do, which they couldn't see the difference. But the idea was that and again, kind of working with Jorge on this idea of bringing back other ways to talk about the heritage, in particular scent in these preserved bays that would smell of the old wood. And looking at the kind of new structure, it was a kind of interesting dialogue between sort of the desire not to do anything, but also the desire to complete the ensemble. And so the building became the kind of meeting of the landscape on one side and the meeting of the building on the street side, which continued the ensemble, and articulating it and folding it to allow for the kind of balloon program and this kind of seating to exist. Here you see the kind of park side and then the street side, where the new building would kind of really carry the roof and bulk of the adjacent warehouses to complete an ensemble while providing a kind of view onto the island as a whole. We just completed the master plan and are waiting to present it.
Moving on to Houston and California and a couple of art projects, this idea of strategy and strategic thinking really applies throughout our work and throughout the different scales that we work. So this is a very small project that required some very big thinking in terms of strategy. This, when we got to the project, this was the public face of the Blaffer Museum and the University of Houston campus. So basically they had some identity issues. The museum is here. The only way you know that is by this sign, and you kind of go through a little slot in the building to the interior courtyard to get in. So almost no real identity to the project. And then when you got to the museum inside, they had some severe circulation issues. There were stairs coming down through the middle of galleries on both floors. And to get from one gallery to the next, on the upper floor, you actually had to walk past all the curators and the director's office and storage and stuff to get over to this other gallery. So a kind of large circulation issues, large identity issues, and no budget. And so what we proposed was to take all the circulation issues and move them to the front of the building in order to create the identity. So kind of trying to kill two birds with one stone and really liberating the entry here. To also create a way to get from the large student and faculty and visitor parking lots that ring the university into the middle of the university, so that instead of something that you had to find your way to, it would be something that was kind of there as you made your way from the city into the campus. And so from a situation like this to a situation like this, the idea was the stair itself becomes the sign. We wanted to cantilever out the stair, but we couldn't afford a cantilever. So we created what we call the wallum, which is a wall that acts like a column. But it also kind of makes a big arrow so that people know how to get into the building. And so, so now you have this condition where from the outside you make your way in through that big arrow through to the campus beyond. And the number of people passing through the museum has increased tenfold. And the number of visitors by 5 or 6 times. So basically people are moving through, students are kind of finding that there's a museum, and it's really increased its viewership and its identity to the outside world. So this is that big entrance way, and here the stair really becomes a moment within not just of circulation but also kind of ancillary exhibition space, so they can hang things there. And then the galleries themselves now completely free of free of stairways and things like that got completely renovated. We introduced a small cafe, which also is bringing in more students, and that's the project. Similarly, now at UC Davis, another university museum, this was a competition, which we lost to some other people in the Friends Network. Well, they used to be in the Friends Network until this moment, but just kidding. They're still in. It's a kind of amazing site, really, between this highway, which is the main highway between Sacramento and San Francisco, in this incredibly benign and benevolent climate on a university which, I mean, basically looks like Beijing in 1975. There's like 6,000 people on bicycles running through the campus. It's a kind of idyll. On this very strange shaped site. So one of the first things we did was to kind of take the mass of the building and try to fit it onto this site, and came up with this idea of a parallelogram, which would really kind of have a face towards the highway and a face towards the campus. So again, this idea of identity and kind of strategically placing the museum as a kind of hinge between campus and city. And then simply by extruding the center of this parallelogram, creating this shape which has a kind of very big public face on the campus side, and then a second face towards the highway, and then inserting some voids and carving it to create a series of different experiences. So a very, very simple shape, like a parallelogram. We just bring up 2 walls that actually has a kind of amazing number of permutations and views. So from the highway, it's this kind of big boulevard. As you make your way around, the roof actually comes down to the ground, and you begin to see up it in a kind of kind of unexpected way, and then a kind of big public face on the campus side, really open with this big canopy, and then in the lobby, trying to create a number of things that would again attract students and bring them into the museum. So putting the art really right in front, and then having this kind of display staircase where you could do homework or hang out, take advantage of the free Wi-Fi, and get exposed to art. And then cutting, because of the climate so amazing there, cutting 2 voids through the building. So you have this kind of really interesting connections between inside and outside, where these holes are kind of cut through, creating kind of outdoor spaces within the building in unexpected places. And here you see an overview of the entire building.
Another competition we lost, got second place, is the Sylvan Theater competition in Washington, D.C. We collaborated with Balmori Associates, with Diana on this project. The project was to design to replace the current Sylvan Theater on the site just adjacent to the monument. What's interesting about the mall is, looking at McCarg's kind of initial kind of layering plan, it is really a site that floods, and we wanted to kind of consider that relationship between kind of architecture and landscape again. Looking at the history of the site and the kind of tension in its history between the sort of formal landscape plans of Macmillan and the kind of more informal / picturesque plans of Downing, which you can see here. So we wanted to kind of create a dialogue between the two. And what's beautiful about a Sylvan Theater is that it is really a moment that a kind of clearing that you discover in a forest. There has this, and we wanted to capture some of that. And so the kind of main idea was how to kind of integrate architecture in this amazing landscape without creating a landform building or large roof, but rather start to pick up on the sort of path, a kind of wiggle around the trees that would become a kind of knot building within the trees, sort of that you would kind of encounter almost by accident, and then would continue and connect the larger park beyond. And so that really became the idea for the kind of the building part of the theater that held a restaurant, exhibition space in terms of the program, but really this kind of idea of knot where trees would be inside and outside of it, and an idea of thinness where you couldn't really tell in terms of depth where the building started and where the trees ended. Working with Alice Waters, the kind of organic chef, we I don't know what's going on. We kind of re-examined how we could organize the restaurant in terms of the kitchen and the dining area, where the kitchen would totally spill into the dining area, and the sort of front back of the house would disappear, and you would have a sort of continuity from growing of the food on the roof to the cooking to the dining, in following having the program follow this kind of idea of a continuous thin sort of knot with all of the planting at the roof. It was still too big for the mall, and so a landform building one.
So in 2008, we won the Young Architects program at MoMA and built PF1, Public Farm 1, a farm with 50 different types of fruits and vegetables made out of cardboard tubes, which really launched a series of projects about the link between architecture and agriculture, including kind of propositions for vertical farms, for aquaponic structures, which we've now proposed 3 different times, never to be built, to ideas about what would happen to the future city when roads were no longer necessary for cars and could be farmed, etc. And through this kind of series of projects, we met Alice Waters and John Lyons, our client, who were involved in setting up the first edible schoolyard in New York City. And this is a project that Alice Waters has been doing in Berkeley for about 15 years, where elementary and middle school children work in a garden, or they cook the food that they have grown. And it's completely tied in with what they're studying in school. So if they're studying the Middle East history, they'll be cooking Middle Eastern food. For mathematics, they're talking about measuring. For science, it's all about growing, or how water boils, etc. So a kind of completely integrated curriculum, which has now been translated to New York City. We also had the support of the School Construction Authority and the City Council, who basically funded the project on the condition that we would not just build one in Brooklyn, which is the first one, which was completed late last year, but to do one in every borough. So we're now embarking on the second and third projects for this. So this is PS 216 in Brooklyn. This used to be a parking lot. So the very first thing we did, gardens are easier to build than buildings. That's kind of like words to live by, if you're considering landscape architecture. So basically the garden was able to be built 3 years before the building because of how long it takes to do a building. So we ripped up the parking lot, took out the soil, put new soil in, and have been growing fruits and vegetables there for 3 years so far. And this is a kind of outdoor classroom where the kids meet at the beginning of every session, talk about what they're going to learn, go out and do their chores and their activities, and then come back and discuss about their observations and how things have gone. And then, of course, in Berkeley, you know, there's lots of space. So they have like a dozen acres. There's lots of climate, so they don't really worry about the winter time. But of course, here we have winter. I'm not sure if some of you may have noticed. It's winter time, which is when the kids are in school, and we don't have a lot of space. So the idea was a kind of densifying of this idea of cooking and growing, and also trying to make it a 4-season operation. So the project that we came up with for the kitchen classroom was to combine it with a greenhouse. So it's a building and a greenhouse. In the greenhouse, they're able to work in the wintertime and have the outdoor classes in the greenhouse and start the seeds there. And then kitchen classroom space for 3 different cooking stations. And then what we call the systems wall, which is a kind of series of infrastructure for the building, everything from heating and cooling to the bathroom to the water cistern. So all 3 elements really work together. So the roofs line up, for example, to collect rainwater in the cistern here, which is visible from the tool shed, which is here. So the building itself also becomes a kind of teaching tool. And the idea was to kind of spark children's curiosity at every level. And this is the project as finished. Here you see in Gravesend, really at the edge of Brooklyn, one of the least green neighborhoods in New York City, with one of the highest rates of obesity and other kind of food-related health issues. And here's the kind of 3 elements. Each element has its own material quality. There it is from the back. You see the service wall. And here you see the 3 elements. Each one has a material quality. So the service wall is clad in sprayed-on rubber, kind of blue rubber, and then this is in shingle, the cementitious shingles, and then aluminum and glass for the kitchen classroom. In trying to decide how to design the facade, some of our favorite work are the Best stores from the 1970s. This is 1980s. This is Site's last Best project, where kind of forest is growing behind this crumbling facade. And then also Venturi Roch and Scott Brown did this in kind of amazing Best store in Pennsylvania with this pattern. And so we took inspiration from that pattern, the idea that kind of nature and architecture could exist in a kind of iconic way, and kind of reinterpreted the pattern in pixels. And as pixels used these cementitious shingles, which are actually quite common around. There's a very cheap kind of low-end building product that we worked with the manufacturer to kind of develop this painting system, and also to increase decrease the spacing. So it's a much tighter grid. Normally these are really elongated kind of tiles, and so it's a tighter, more pixelized grid that then is painted in these different colors that makes up the pattern. And here you see the greenhouse and the kitchen classroom. I mean, so these kids are literally eating kale and smiling and asking for seconds. It's kind of amazing. And here's the project at night in the greenhouse.
In 2012, we won an international competition to design a new conference center in Gabon, in West Africa, for the capital called Libreville. What's amazing about Gabon is its kind of landscape and ecology, incredibly varied and still incredibly preserved. And one of the reasons why it is so preserved is that the city is very, very dense on the water, leaving the rest to be quite natural. Gabon, like much of Africa, has a really interesting modernist history. Incredible buildings that have not been sort of documented. And that was really kind of an inspiration for us in terms of that era of optimism. The conference center project we were commissioned to design is for the next African Union summit, which happens every other year in a specific city in Africa. One of the key figures we discovered and got inspired by as we were researching the architectural history is Diolivo, seen here. An Italian architect who worked a lot in Africa and in the Middle East, and who had a kind of tangential relationship with Solari, and in particular was already interested in these ideas of ecology and urbanism, and designed the master plan for Libreville, this kind of wiggly line, but that would be incredibly dense along the water. He also designed a number of structures, many of which were destroyed, such as this really beautiful market, which became a kind of site of informal gatherings. The conference center is in a large park called the Cité de la Démocratie, with a lot of governmental institutions, UN, etc. And we, being a conference center for the African Union, we wanted it had to be about kind of representing a Gabon, an emerging Gabon in the name of the president, and a kind of emerging Gabon that enlists green and the kind of preservation of its ecology as its main kind of force to emerge. And so the project really became about this kind of disc that would be carved by these courtyards, which would kind of represent the various ecosystems of the country. Part of the idea, kind of following on some of the ideas of the edible schoolyard, is that the building would be really integrated with the park and the landscape beyond, and the roof, which would be the main facade as you entered the cité, because of its slope, would collect water in the middle of it, and then kind of recycle it throughout the site in a kind of system that kind of engaged the architecture and the landscape together with these series of ponds. And so to kind of really think of that cycle as kind of unifying. The idea of kind of really integrating architecture and landscape sort of carries to the facade, which is the idea of transparency, of being inside and outside. The facade is going to be built out of stone. It's African stone, but it is being cut in Italy, and that was the mock-up in Italy, looking at kind of different angles to try to vary the transparency as you move up the facade, and create a sense of depth and layering from the outside to the gardens and then to the building beyond. In that space in between, this outer skin and the inner skin, is the kind of promenade, which we imagine to be for informal gatherings. Sort of after the conferences, you kind of you start walking with someone, and new ideas and new conclusions and kind of new diplomatic conclusions kind of appear. And so that promenade carries throughout the building and gives you a view of the kind of park and landscape beyond on one hand, and then on the other gives you a view of one of the courtyards. And this is kind of locating the promenade in the current drawings. And so this is the kind of the building really, which is kind of clad in stone and then carved by these courtyards. The stone carries to the roof, and each courtyard has a really kind of intricate shape. One of them, for instance, this one is the kind of rainforest courtyard that was designed to actually have a waterfall. So just to kind of the various landscapes are the kind of Inselberg, which is a kind of very dry, stony landscape, the rainforest, and the orchard, looking at kind of new ideas about agriculture for the country, and then the water collecting pool in the middle with the little kitchen garden for the restaurant. And so the water rainforest courtyard has a kind of all of the species, and all of the water collection actually happens here, and we've just finished mocking that up near Vermont. The Inselberg kind of courtyard has this amazing kind of stony landscape, which we're kind of working with, and the orchard again tries to kind of come with ideas about agriculture for the country. What was interesting is that there was a conference center on the site that had a kind of very large floor plate. It had an hexagonal shape, and when we won the competition, the idea was to preserve the conference center and kind of wrap it. But as the building developed, the kind of structure got eroded, and so the conference center just got demolished. But we have now in the plans a kind of trace of the old conference center. So contrasting these kind of very big volume inside the space are kind of much more white, much more generic, sort of inspired by this optimistic modernism kind of spaces, where we're really working with light, and in particular we're finding ways to really light the kind of surfaces of these of the underside of the courtyards, looking at tiling with this kind of gold brass like sort of tiles, and using what we call the hex wall as a kind of lantern that makes these surfaces glow. The main auditorium sort of registers the kind of water collection in the top with this kind of undulating ceiling, and the idea is that actually, even in terms of conceptualizing the interior, each venue, each kind of small conference room is thought of as being connected to one of the courtyards. For example, the orchard sort of venue is kind of under the orchard courtyard, and so you have the experience of that ceiling volume above you. The rainforest auditorium here is kind of connected to the rainforest auditorium in terms of its materiality and feel, working with, again, light and transparency to give that sense of clearing. And the Inselberg, here the most technologically outfitted venue, has a view onto the Inselberg auditorium. The press room, so all these environments are very specific, but they are kind of micro-environments within a kind of larger field of sort of white. That's the restaurant and the bar with the view of the cité beyond. We just finished CDs and kind of are very in love with the mechanical system rendering, which are quite complex. And so construction should be starting soon.
Now to China. We had kind of given up on China, but you can never give up on China. So they called, or rather, I should say Jeffrey Johnson called. He's, I think, teaching this semester with Zhu Pei. And Zhu Pei doesn't like to do master plans, so he asked Jeffrey to put together what he called the Columbia University Dream Team in order to create a master plan for a new city of university campuses in a city called Weifang, or a new version of a city called Weifang. And so this is the team that we put together with Jeffrey and Jill from SLAB, WORKac, Kate Orff from SCAPE, and Zhu Pei. And so we have two people from everyone's office working together at WORKac, and it is truly like a collaborative master plan where there is really almost no barriers and no boundary between who works for what office, whether it's landscape or master plan or architecture. And it's been a really great experience. I'm flying tomorrow to China to present the final master plan with JJ. And so here's where Weifang is. It's kind of between Beijing and Shanghai. The city is quite a few kilometers away from the coast, but the new city of Weifang is right on the coast in what's currently salt flats. So this is the aerial, all those are kind of individual lots of salt production here, and you can see over here is already part of the master plan under construction. So we're really looking at this site here, and here, to put it in context, it's here. It's an enormous new city, and our site is here. Our project is to design 7 or 8 new university campuses all together here, and that's next to this site, which already has 12 new university campuses being built on it. So this will be a lot of university campuses. And then just to get, so we did a little bit of a scale comparison of different campus types with Weifang Phase 2 here. Just for comparison, it's about the size of 105 Columbia universities. So also each university campus will be quite big, not like dense and nice that we have here. And so the idea was to, I think they were looking for something more ecological, something different, something more Columbia, if there's such a thing, which means it could be anything. And so working with Kate, especially, we came up with the idea to really integrate, to kind of create fingers almost in the way that we had with Nature City, to create fingers of campus and fingers of wetlands and salt marsh. So not to really draw this kind of firm boundary between the river on the one side and the land on the other, but to really create a kind of mediated zone of wetlands and outdoor space. And what that would do at the same time would really allow us to densify and urbanize the campuses. So we really wanted not to have this kind of sprawling campus type that are kind of popping up all over China, but really to kind of to try to densify it as much as possible on this enormous site. And also to kind of do a cut and fill operation. We did need to raise up the land about 4 meters. And so instead of bringing all that fill to prevent flooding, so the wetlands will help us prevent flooding, but really just to line up with the road that's passing through, we'll be able to take the fill from the site itself. So by creating the wetlands, we're also creating the fill for the site. And that creates this kind of incredible diversity of biohabitats throughout the site, which kind of follow those fingers. And then the idea would be that it's a kind of reverse gradient between landscape and urbanism, where the densest part of the campus would be towards the main road, and then the more open sports fields and recreation areas to the east here. And at the same time, to create to define the different campus zones, to create a series of parkways. We wanted to maintain a pretty much classic U.S. Campus type, where there's vehicular traffic to a certain degree for servicing, but it's a primarily pedestrian and bicycle-oriented campus. So here, the campuses are all oriented along this pedestrian way, and then the parkways kind of organize road traffic and parking, and then there are mixed-use kind of research zones in between, and then one kind of city center in the middle, which is a kind of cross between a campus and research and kind of corporate campuses and things in the middle as well. So kind of, there's 2 campuses here. This is one big campus. There's 2 up here, a couple down there. And, they're building it now, even though we haven't finished the master plan. So they keep calling us, asking, where the roads are going to go. And so here are the different ideas. So the campus quad is really this kind of dense urban core with its pedestrian main drag down the middle. And then these kind of recreational ravines. So all the stormwater will be collected in ravines which head towards the salt marsh. Sorry, here's the pedestrian mall. And then a series of campus quads behind the main space. I mean, this is like, you always see this in every lecture, but just to put it, so as we're designing it, they're like, this is an email from JJ. Sorry for the craziness. The clients are very anxious to get everything moving. They want to start one building by March. So we had to really quickly move from the big master plan into the first campus which would be built. So we kind of put the master plan to bed very early in December and started working on this one, the largest campus, which is about 8 million something. So I don't know. It's big. Sorry. So here's the pedestrian spine, and the idea is that kind of organizes all the main activities with the dormitory. So basically, you have the main campus buildings and a few dorms, the mixed use in the middle, and then quads behind them, and then a series of residential dormitories, and then kind of villas for faculty in the hinterlands before you get to the parkway, and then kind of more dense towards here, towards the sports fields on this side. And this is what it looks like when it's laid out. And here are the very initial renderings, which we're still finishing as I speak to take tomorrow with us. So sorry for that. But you see a kind of diversity of different quad types, which hopefully will be designed by other architects, so that each kind of quad will be designed by an architect, and then special buildings, and then the dormitories here with the parkways and the villas in the background. And here's that main pedestrian drag. It kind of opens up at the canteen where everyone eats and the student center are the kind of filters by which people will come from the dormitories to the main pedestrian mall. And then this is the quads behind the kind of pedestrian mall, which lead kind of from quad to quad. So you can also have this kind of alternative path through the quads. And then dorms on the outskirts. And that's it.
Last project, back to New York via Portland. We just completed the offices for White & Kennedy here in New York. White & Kennedy is an advertising agency. They did the ads for the MoMA project. And they really started in Portland. Some of you may know Portlandia. One of the episodes was shot in the Portland office of White & Kennedy. And so Portland is really part of their DNA in terms of a kind of nature-loving kind of city. White & Kennedy is a kind of, as many of these kinds of offices are, very global. And so a lot of the kind of, again, research into the identity was, how is White & Kennedy sort of both Portland and New York at the same time? And this is the project. They have 3 floors on Barrack up here. And so this became an occasion for us to think about work and the kind of workspaces and kind of go back to Google, which sort of revolutionized work in terms of turning it into play. But what was interesting about Google, and my students are smiling because we've been looking at that as well in terms of the bank, but what was interesting about Google is that it was not only about play, but there was an idea, a kind of almost suburban idea of kind of sprawl. And so when Clive Wilkinson talked about the kind of new workspaces, it was really about this kind of main street and the little islands off of the main street. And so taking actually a very urban approach or engaging this urban kind of discourse, but for New York, we started with this question of density. And the idea that we would design a kind of office space that would be significantly kind of denser than other kind of office spaces, and as a result be able to sort of come up with additional collective space. And so we also looked at this kind of, in Marisa Meyer's term, put back work in work. And rather than talk, introduce slides and sort of balloons and massage nooks, looked at kind of where work happened and where conversation happened, and came up with a kind of different types of meeting spaces according to time. So the 5-minute standing meeting space, the 10-minute phone booth space where you want privacy but you don't need a lot of space, and that became the kind of main generator for the kind of organization, with the kind of gradient in terms of scale and privacy, and a number of kind of key large collective spaces in the project. And so this just got completed. This is showing a meeting room. This is the kind of open office, kind of more generic areas where we recycled much of the and the stand-up meeting, which is a long kind of table. Working with the height and elevation so that some of the kind of meeting spaces are more lounge-like and a little higher, giving you privacy. And here, phone booth scale, and then a kind of closed meeting space. the main conference room with the homage to the Whitney ceiling. And then every space is outfitted technologically for meeting. And so rather than kind of having a very open office type, we structured the office in terms of neighborhoods of 25 people. Somehow we got to 25 as the ideal scale for kind of work neighborhood. And every neighborhood would have a meeting room, a counter, a sort of stand-up meeting space, lounge, etc., etc. But then most interestingly for us was how we would connect these 3 floors and in section rather than sort of taking Google and folding it to create density in section, and what would be the kind of main collective spaces that would sort of organize and create synergy between the 3 floors without creating an atrium, which is the default in these kinds of offices. Taking budget as well and looking at sort of what would be the most efficient cut in the floor in terms of budget, but also in terms of size. The circle allows you for the biggest cut, and we actually only had to remove 1 column. And so it became, again, this kind of Mata Clark idea of connecting floors through these holes that would be indirect and kind of replace the idea of an atrium. So that's the main entrance point as you walk in with this kind of big stair that is the first connector. And then from that big stair, which is also a sort of a gathering space, you have views all the way up to the 3rd floor and then a series of possibilities for programming and getting together. Moving up the stairs, the second main collective space is the bar. And then moving up the bar and looking all the way down to moving up to the den. And if you're an ad agency, you need a sports area. So this is our gym, which doubles as a kind of performance space. And then finally, we wanted to kind of make a statement on the facade, but there on the 6th, 7th, and 8th floor. So it was very hard. But what we did to do that is basically change the line of the glass and moved the glass to the inside, creating basically a double height outdoor space in the building. So when you look up the building, there's a hole, which is kind of interesting. Also a work environment where they've been doing yoga. That's what we need here. And that's it.
Thank you.
We have questions?
Thanks very much. No, thanks. Early on in the talk, you mentioned representation is playing a large role in the practice, and so I'm just wondering if you could maybe elaborate on how in the different projects you position representation based on the type of project or the audience, and sort of what it allows you to do.
What it allows
you to do, sort of like how you might be using representation in different ways to drive projects or in relationships with different audiences and clients.
Oh, well, I would say that this is a question that we're asking ourselves now. But one of the big questions when you're quote unquote working globally is there's this feeling sometimes that you shouldn't be there, right? that you're kind of coming from outside or coming from the top, or we still are operating with these ideas, and I think that a lot of these are, I would say, also consequences of the last 10 years and this kind of very large-scale sort of iconic architecture. And so we are finding that we're still stuck between the notion that you're either highly local or very superficial and global, and we're trying to operate in between. And to operate in between, we are rejecting this notion of authenticity or trying to resist kind of cultural over quoting, or as if to apologize. I'm here, but hey, I'm going to put Islamic patterns to excuse myself for being here. But rather, I think we're more interested in kind of following some of the lines of work of, let's say, the tropical modernists, or looking what we've been, at least up until now, very interested in representing is the relationship between architecture and landscape, between cities and nature, and how they intersect with architecture. And so hopefully it's not always that literal, but we'd rather operate there as a kind of shared ground or as a kind of conversation starter than so far anywhere else. So I hope that.
Yeah, it's really exciting lecture to see. Thank you. I want to maybe ask a question on like your relationship to the media, because I see a very different approach from many of the other like big ex-OMA firms, and perhaps like a more discreet relationship to like the architecture being so publicized, and also the process of getting commissions, which happens through being like also, especially at the global scale, being important in the media, on the internet also. And like maybe talk about diagrams, for instance, for the museum with the wall column. It was really interesting to see the kind of architectural presentation, which is more typically what we see on Arch Daily, etc., like the diagrams. Because I had only seen the front image, and I have to say that I liked the project a lot better after getting the explanation, because I could understand the form. And when I first saw it on the media, I thought it was very arbitrary, and I just discarded it, which I think is an interesting dynamic, and perhaps allows you to practice, to like be more like real, let's say, with regards to your clients and the people you're actually building for. So I wonder if you have like, what do you think?
You discarded our museum?
Just talking about the Blaffer in particular, I would say that what's been interesting is that it hasn't, how can I say it without, it's not that significant architecturally, but for us it's significant because it was about strategy, and that we were excited to work strategically with an institution and do so much with $1 million, but maybe we shouldn't advertise that we do $1 million projects. But I think that for a long time, I mean, sometimes we're interested more in strategy than in architecture, but that's changing. I don't know. About OMA? Well, I'm glad we're over it. I don't know what to say about that.
We've had 11 years post-OMA, so the tattoo has gradually faded.
But I mean, we've actively engaged with that history and kind of, found what we like about it and what we don't like about it. So it's
like around, like in terms of like have to mitigate and like come to an agreement. So in a time of war, diplomats will meet to try to like limit the damage. And I think, what I see is like much more of a concern for like creating like value in the building itself rather than creating value for the press. And in that sense, I think the practice has to be praised in like comparison to other ex-OMA firms which will like battle against each other. I don't know if you remember the like OMA versus Big in Miami just a few months ago, but it was really
how'd
just
that work out?
this battle of ego, like on the internet over the media, and I find like maybe this is more focused on the people themselves and the communities, like the communities of non-architects that live in the building.
Well, thank you.
It's super nice seeing the work. I had not seen it all together. And I see a very strong, beautiful kind of pop image come up. And I think it feels really American to me in a really good way. Kind of like a optimistic, the reference to sight and the reference to nature in a kind of pop way, in a kind of like, so I was wondering if pop in general or Americana in particular have a, if there's a kind of interest that you see in your practice there.
Yeah, I mean, sure, definitely. I'll take this one.
Well, he's funny.
We're at least half American, that's for sure. I don't, it's not, it's definitely not conscious. I mean, obviously we like things that are poppy in terms of color and the shape and everything. But it's not a conscious Americana. But, when I do think of like, our kind of current crop of heroes, which range from Ant Farm, I teach here with Chip every year, which is really great, and Sight and Venturi and Scott Brown. Yeah, we do. I mean,
Dan sketches on yellow trays. Yeah.
But the thing is, like, for example, when I think about the perfect pop, I think about the Citroën. Like the Citroën, it's a perfect pop machine, but it's European, right? And I wonder, there's never been like a pop tiny American car. Like, so I'm thinking, like Mini Cooper, pop, and Citroën, and maybe you're trying to find a way that takes that kind of pop spirit, but kind of finds a way of doing it fully American without the Citroën.
I mean, I think what links it is really optimism. Like, we're really into optimism, obviously, and I think that and optimism and America kind of seem to kind of go together. But in Africa, in Libreville, like what really attracted us first about the city and these buildings that we showed is this kind of incredibly happy modernism, this kind of optimistic, like cantilevers, brise-soleil, open, just open up to the outside, and this kind of sense of this country and this region discovering itself, post-colonial, and in a kind of much more optimistic and serious but also fun way than we had really realized. And it's that kind of spirit of optimism, which may be American or may be just modern, that we really wanted to tap into. And it's this kind of aspect of modernism that is just, you just forget about. You think it's just the grids and the glass, and then, in this at least in the tropics, it just became this whole other thing.
I think actually it's a nice spot to end, because I could claim that could be translated as something to do with smiling. Like even modern architecture smiles sometimes. In Africa. For sure. But it was just such a thrill, like Carly said, it was so great to see the work, and there's a relentless consistency to the work also. It's a single project. So kind of like the diagram, which one can just imagine where it goes next. It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.